Hello, everyone. This is going to be something a little bit different, I think, than usual, but it will be nice to get some more content out to you guys without having me to research or edit a whole nother video. So really what I'm going to do is talk about modern fantasy in this podcast episode, I suppose you could call it. It will be published as a video, but we'll have a little bit more content to talk about, and I hopefully can engage you guys more in the comments about what your opinions are on this. Eventually, I would like to talk to other people too, face to face, and record their responses. I think that's makes for better content than just hearing one person's opinions all the time. But with that said, this will be mostly my opinion, and it should be interesting, I think. This first episode, I'm going to talk a lot about Brandon Sanderson. I'm going to talk about prose, about Sarah J. Maas and the kind of romantasy era, and just what I think modern fantasy has become, where it's going, and where it came from. Fantasy is really popular for good reason. So I think I'll start a little bit with Sarah J. Maas, mostly because I have the least experience with her work. I haven't really read the entirety of any of her stories, although I am familiar with A Court of Thorns and Roses, and the forthcoming books, and I have read summaries of the plots of the ones I have not read because I generally did not like them. But what might surprise my audience when we're talking about modern fantasy is that I don't think modern fantasy is bad. As in, I don't think that it is markedly worse than the fantasy that came, let's say, like through the 1960s to the 1980s. It might be worse than like the beginnings of the 2000s and the 90s in a popular sense. But pulp fantasy has been around forever, since probably the end of the Second World War. And before that is mostly mythology, and kind of fantasy was a little bit different there. It was more of a romantic feeling. Of course, you have Shakespeare. Midsummer Night's Dream is a fantasy play, but it's not really fantasy in the way that modern readers see it. So that progression is pretty short, all things told. I mean, from the middle of the 20th century or the beginning of the 20th century to now. And what we've ended up with is a kind of beautiful, extant reading scope. Like we have incredible literary works, something like, I would say, The Chronicles of Narnia for younger audiences, but also, of course, Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, done by his brother. We have the Gormenghast trilogy, which I will talk about a lot. Terry Pratchett, and then we get into Terry Pratchett's more of like the modern style. It's kind of comical and more fascinating, a lot of world building done. And then we have, of course, Brandon Sanderson and Sarah J. Maas. So I will start from the end, which is Maas, and then Rebecca Yarros is very popular right now. And what I want to get out there first is that you should not stop people or attempt to stop people from liking things that they initially like. So if they engage with a material, let's say Fourth Wing, for an example, and this is the first book they've read in forever, or it's their 700th book and they really like it, and they tell you face to face that they really like it, it's just a polite human thing to accept that, to say, oh yeah, I am glad that you like that. And that's the reaction that I have. I am so glad that someone wants to talk to me about a book, even if it's a book I haven't read. I have not read Fourth Wing. I don't think I ever will. But the amount of people now today who talk to me about books who would never have read a book before this is incredible. And even though it is something that we would regard as less literary, or perhaps we think that the authors are not editing or are not controlling their text in a way that we find respectful, doesn't mean that the story is useless. Pulp fantasy has been like this for decades, and just because now it is becoming more and more popular with things like Book Talk and BookTube, does not mean that it is worse, even if we can see it and pull some funny quotes from it. What I will say, though, obviously I don't really enjoy these books, but I don't enjoy Brandon Sanderson as well, so I'll kind of cover him after this kind of diatribe. But the main thing that I think is holding back romantasy as a genre is a lack of respect for dialogue. Dialogue is really, really, really hard to write. And especially in romance, so much of what I find compelling, I personally find compelling in romance literature, is what people don't say as opposed to what they do say. So we've kind of run into this issue where having characters say something to another character without actually saying it is kind of how people actually talk to each other, especially in a romantic sense. You know, it's difficult for us to admit that we like someone, or even to admit to ourselves that we like someone. And when we're forced into engagements with them, especially awkward engagements, which are kind of a hallmark of this genre, we like to dance around the subject. And I find that really compelling because I think it's a really human way to act. And the way fantasy works, a lot of dialogue needs to be expository in nature. We need to explain things to the reader. So whether or not we're writing in first person, which is very famous, especially in young adult, but also in romantasy, or third person, we have to kind of give a window to a character's inner dialogue. And when you give the reader a window to the inner dialogue, it's going to be really, really difficult to write dialogue that is not as expository as the inner monologue. You're going to kind of be competing. You're going to try and be really expository on what a character is feeling, especially the main character, and then you're going to have to hide that, if you want good dialogue, from things that the main character wouldn't know. The books, though, aren't that bad. Like, sure, there's some funny lines, and there's some terrible plot elements, and some very, very trope-laden plot lines, and but that doesn't mean they're terrible. A lot of things have tropes and are written well. It's just like world building, right? You're building the character by telling the audience what the character thinks. Unfortunately, people don't really talk like that, do they? Well, okay, let's talk about Brandon Sanderson really quick. On the other side of romantasy is this kind of love of epic fantasy, which is equally as great, right? Romance and fantasy can work well, just like the way romance works well. I guess let me go back really quick and say that sex can also work really well in novels. Lady Chatterley's Lover is one of the greatest novels ever published, mostly because of how difficult it was to publish. And D.H. Lawrence had an immense amount of trouble trying to talk to people about sex and talk about how women have sex, which is just not something that people could understand or ever read in a book until he did that. And so doing that is important. Again, doing that is really, really hard. People have sex in thousands of different ways for thousands of different reasons. And some people don't understand why another person would at all. They just can't kind of get into that headspace. And so when you're writing here, you take on an immense, immense amount of responsibility to do it in a way that a lot of people can either learn from or understand intuitively. And I think a respect for how difficult that is something that we can look forward to or appreciate in authors who do that well and kind of acknowledge that other authors don't. Anyway, okay, back to Brandon Sanderson. Epic fantasy has become really, really popular, and I love epic fantasy too. It's the rich world building, kind of reminds me of a lot of late 20th century sci-fi, like Ursula K. Le Guin with things like The Lathe of Heaven. There's just a lot of cool aspects to a world that we don't live in. Again, we run into the same problem though, and that is exposition. Do you have a character exposit the world, or do you just say it in third person? If you're in first person, do you have the main character just think about the world that they live in? Like be reminded of mundane things that generally people don't think about? I think that is also really, really difficult, and it's not done properly, especially in things like Mistborn. I know a lot of people really like Mistborn, or specifically The Final Empire, I think is the worst one from a writing perspective, although maybe the second one too. The Final Empire has Kelsier as the main expository element, and a lot of times he'll just be telling Vin something about a world that she lives in that I suspect she would probably know. But even if she doesn't, if it's things like the structure of the hierarchy, it gets really, really difficult to read because it's just a character telling you stuff. I think that a lot of masters of the genre don't do this, and they have really, really sparse dialogue. Again, that's just something that I really like, is when it can be introduced to me without knowing. And Sanderson knows this. As some of you probably know, he has an entire series of lectures at BOE about storytelling, and there is some really, really good advice in there. If you want to get published in a modern day setting in fantasy, you would do well to follow his advice. But here's the thing. I don't write genre fiction, and I don't enjoy the elements of publishing industries as like degrees, as a way to tell whether a book is good or not. Like, if a book is very publishable, that doesn't mean that it's a good book, that it's a piece of art that I would like to enjoy. And that might be better for you. Like, if a lot of readers love the trends in publishing right now, and that's why they're the trends in publishing. You know, they like really complex worlds. They like fascinating magic systems. They like tropes to be used in specific ways, but that are like just a little different, They like 1,200 page books that they can put on bookshelves. And there's nothing wrong with that. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And they can be beautiful works of art that you keep in your house, even if they're very, very long. But that's just not what I enjoy. I really like books where an author trusts you with something very difficult to explain. Perhaps they have felt this way about their world, and they make a fantasy world to try and explain this. And the thing they're talking about, they know not everyone will understand, because they understand it this way, and they're trying their best to give it in a way that other people can, but they can't. The more that they do that, the more they efface themselves out of the work. And so they're trying to split that middle. And I think that's where beautiful works of literature come, when an author trusts me to understand them through a piece of artwork. Most people today don't really like that, in that they would rather it be catered to a wider audience, especially publishers. The more people, the easier you make your things in your book understandable, the more publishable it is, the more people you can reach. And it is totally fine to like that. But personally, I just love it when an author can tell that what they're trying to say is difficult. They're going to give it to me. So one more thing on prose for Brandon Sanderson. I've talked a little bit about The Final Empire, and I've read The Way of Kings too. The Way of Kings is certainly better, but Sanderson definitely follows what he calls in his lectures Orwellian prose. Specifically, he talks about window pane prose and compares this to stained glass prose. Where window pane prose comes from is from a single essay, it's only about 3 pages long, by Orwell, in his book, or his collection of essays, Politics and the English Language. Let's read the section really quick. This specific one is an essay called Why I Write. Quote, "Looking back through the last page or two, I see that I have made it appear as though my motives in writing were wholly public-spirited. I don't want to leave that as the final impression. All writers are vain, selfish, and lazy, and at the very bottom of their motives, there lies a mystery. Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist or understand. For all one knows, that demon is simply the same instinct that makes a baby squall for attention. And yet it is also true that one can write nothing readable unless one constantly struggles to efface one's own personality. Good prose is like a window pane. I cannot say with certainty which of my motives are the strongest, but I know which of them deserve to be followed. And looking back through my work, I see that it is invariably where I lacked a political purpose that I wrote lifeless books and was betrayed into purple passages, sentences without meaning, decorative adjectives, and humbug generally." End quote. So that's very different from how this is normally contextualized. And I think it really deletes how beautiful this metaphor is of a window pane. Orwell is not saying that your prose needs to be entirely clear to everyone. He's not saying that you should have no gauze, no tint between the writer and what is happening in the writer's mind, because you can't do that. The perspective of the writer is inherent to the piece. That's what he means by, and yet we can write nothing readable without effacing ourselves. We have to delete some of our ways, but we can't delete all of it, because, the last sentence, where I lacked a political purpose, I wrote lifeless books. So he's saying that good prose is like a window pane. It's as clear as we can make it, but it implies a political perspective, like a physical perspective of a window pane. You must fight between these two motives, being able to communicate with others and being able to have your personality, your political perspective in the piece. And that's just such a beautiful way to think about writing that is kind of deleted from modern interpretations of window pane prose and stained glass prose. By the way, he never says stained glass prose in any of these essays. So that's kind of, I don't know who added it. The first time I can see it is through Sanderson, but the way he thinks about those two things is certainly different from how I generally think about those things. And again, we go back to trust, right? Authors that trust you know that they need to have a perspective on something. They need to be saying something about something they understand, but that the thing they're going to talk about is so complicated that they can make it as clear as possible, but it will still imply that perspective. That, I think, is beautiful. A little bit more on Sanderson. While his understanding of prose, I think, is flawed, his dialogue is also very expository. The worlds he creates are very vast, and a lot of people love that, and you should love that if that's something you really enjoy. It kind of falls for me a little bit into the not trusting me section. I think it's just a little too clear what is happening. He doesn't trust me to remember the name of the character that he's talking about in most of his sentences, and constantly reminds us who's talking, what a face this character is making. And I think those beats especially are very intrusive into the flow of the dialogue. There's some, especially with his newest novel, some thought about whether or not he is edited very well. I think that is very difficult to tell from a reader's perspective. And really only Brandon Sanderson is going to know exactly how much changed between his vision and the editing process. Okay, I have one more thing to say about Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson loves to talk about the history of fantasy, and I like listening to him for the most part, but most of the people he talks about is like Jordan, and he talks about a little bit about Rothfuss as a contemporary, but he talks about Terry Pratchett, and Tolkien, of course, and then as a quote from when he starts ending these talks about the history of fantasy, he'll say, oh, and then it kind of cascades into mythology, which, as you remember, is how I opened this podcast episode. But that's not how I look at fantasy, mostly because of my addiction, as you can tell by the video that I just released, with Ursula K. Le Guin. If you're going to talk about the history of fantasy, and you're not going to mention both Ursula K. Le Guin and Mervyn Peake, I don't know what to say. Mervyn Peake is one of the big three of, I think it's called Grand World authors he's written, but the Gormenghast trilogy is an incredible cornerstone in fantasy writing. I know some modern readers probably won't see it as fantasy, as there's not really like a magic system or dragons or anything, but historically, it's a huge, huge piece of fantasy history. And just to have Sanderson, as far as I can tell, never mention it and never talk about it, or Earthsea. Earthsea changed a lot from how we not only viewed fantasy, but how we viewed children's books, how we viewed what fantasy could teach us, that it could be a tool for philosophy, and it could be literary in a sense. I remember Ursula K. Le Guin sent in her scripts or her manuscripts to her editors and her agent, and they said she writes very well, but they didn't know what she was doing. And it's because fantasy wasn't a philosophy tool back then until Ursula changed it. And so I get disappointed when listening to Sanderson talk about the history of fantasy and him not mention both Mervyn Peake. Gormenghast is beautiful. If you have not read the Gormenghast trilogy, you absolutely should. Mervyn Peake himself really struggled at the end of his life with Parkinson's disease. And watching, so it goes Titus, Groan, Gormenghast, Titus alone, and that's kind of at the middle of Titus alone is when he started experiencing some pretty severe symptoms of his disease. And then Titus Awakes, or Boy in Darkness was the last thing I think he published in print, besides paintings before his death. And then his wife finished Titus Awake at the very end. But both Titus Alone and Boy in Darkness are incredible, incredible explorations of the psyche of someone who feels like they're losing control of their body. And using fantasy in that way is incredible. It's a beautiful read. His prose is also beautiful. It's a painter. He's a painter too. So it's like, it's like reading a book by a painter. You know, it's all about how beautiful the setting is, about the crumbling towers of Gormenghast Castle and Gormenghast Mountain and the wind and people's faces and how funny people's names are. There's like Prune Squalor, Chef Swelter, Steerpike, Fuchsia, just incredibly evocative characters that I love to visit again. So I guess those would be my two recommendations. Obviously, Earthsea. I just made a whole video on Earthsea. I love it so much, mostly because also Ursula K. Le Guin, I feel so connected to her as a fantasy author. She is just so humble. She has an incredible journey, not only as a writer, but through the Pacific Northwest, which is where I'm from too. In the documentary that I watched, one of them for writing the Earthsea video, she is just shown as an old woman walking on a beach, Cannon Beach in Oregon, and she's playing with a long strand of kelp, just like throwing it around. And it's just so adorable to watch this old woman play with kelp, because I've done that. I've been to that beach. I've been to all beaches all up the Pacific Northwest, and I've played with kelp as a whip as a kid, just like she did. I feel just so connected to how she likes literature, how she writes, and what she thinks of what the written word can do. So that kind of biases me towards reading Earthsea. But that being said, the Other Wind, which is the final book in the Earthsea hexology, is my favorite piece of fantasy fiction of all time, just because it does that. She holds a book out to me and trusts me with these complicated things. And if you really like fantasy, if you're just getting into reading again after a long stint, and you like Romantasy or Brandon Sanderson or whatever, Rothfuss, Rebecca Yarros, it doesn't matter. That is great. I'm so glad people are reading and being excited about books, even if the books are not my thing. And you should too. You should be happy that other people are reading so that we can have more people to talk with books about. And I hope, not because this is the correct way to engage with literature, but because it's my favorite way to engage with literature. I hope you read a book and you can tell that the author trusts you with something difficult. And if you realize as you're reading that you've had a same experience, or that they found a way to explain something that you couldn't explain, I hope that feeling of trust is something you look for in other books and other genres and in literature. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to try and release one of these videos after every mainline video, just talking about the research done for each specific video, and also just double checking in with my audience and making sure I'm doing what you guys want. Perhaps the titles could be here. As for changes of the channel, I kind of want to talk about ads. I'm not very good at deciding where ads to go in the video, so usually I just let YouTube do it. But I have heard from some people that there are too many ads, so I will go in and take them out, or just put in the ones that I think work, so that you guys are not being served too many ads and you can actually engage with the content. Additionally, there are avenues, if I find ways of monetization outside of this, just to get rid of ads completely, which would, of course, would be ideal. I would love it for people just to engage with the content and not need to worry about that. Because I am creating this for free, and I want to talk to you guys about it because I love talking with you about reading, not because I want you to be eyes that ads can watch. So I will work on that. So just bear with me a little bit. I do think my audio needs a little bit of work. I really like this kind of close talking. Generally, my plosives have been a little bit better than before because of the position of my mic, but my auto editing still could use some work. So be careful with that throughout the next ones. I also want to talk about the Blood Meridian video, which both things that I thought went well, conclusions I reached while researching that didn't make it in the video, and also, of course, the things I messed up on and got incorrect. And I also just want to read some comments from that video because so many people commented on that video with their thoughts on Blood Meridian and Cormac McCarthy and William Faulkner. And I want to engage with that for sure, as well as admit where I could have improved the tone of the essay overall. Generally, mostly because I was very aggressive, I think some people thought, to the Vile Eyes video. And I shouldn't have. I should have kind of just explained what I wanted and what I thought of the book, and that would have been better. But I will talk about that in a future video. For now, I will let you guys go and look forward to the next video, which should be coming out in about, I think, 3 weeks. 3 weeks from now is a good time. All right. I'll talk to you later.